Next up, we have Gautam Shah. Gautam is a National Geographic Fellow and the founder of Internet of Elephants. I'm going to bring him up here. Hello, Gautam. I'll give you a little bit
Hi,
of
Brianna.
So Gautam is the founder of Internet of Elephants, a social enterprise that tells us stories about wildlife and its conservation through games and other digital experiences. He's lived in the United States, India, Argentina, and Kenya, and decided to quit his job in IT after 20 years in order to pursue new ways that technology can be used for wildlife conservation. I'm really excited to learn more about this. Welcome to the Biodiversity Festival.
Great. Thank you so much, Brianna. I appreciate being here.
Yeah. Happy World Biodiversity Day. So tell us a little bit more about what your work is and where you've lived.
Yeah, absolutely. I currently live in Kenya. I live close to a town called Nanyuki, which is right on the equator, about 200 kilometers north of Nairobi. So it's in the evening here. And yeah, I'll tell a little bit of story during the talk, but I spent 20 years as an IT consultant at a huge company called Accenture, 400,000 people. And then there came a moment, and there came a very specific moment where I made the decision that I needed to start applying my background and what I knew in IT to something that I really dearly loved, and that was wildlife and wildlife conservation. At the time, I was working at Accenture in Nairobi. And so when I quit and decided I'm going to get into a sector that I don't know anybody in, it didn't make sense to go back to Chicago, which is where I'm from. And so I decided to stay in Kenya and keep going from there.
Yeah, I see some animal photos behind you.
Yeah, I mean, but that's all from my pre-wildlife conservation days. Like that's from the days when I had, well, honestly, when I had time and money to go on pretty fantastic, wildlife holidays. And now it's a little bit of a different story. But yeah, I was pretty crazy about it.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, I think everybody here shares that passion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's this group is probably not going to be that interested in that story, but a lot of the talks that I give are to non-wildlife people and to non-conservation people, and so that story always seems to resonate quite a bit.
So I think you have a presentation for us. Is that right?
I do. I'm going to share it. I will share it in a second.
All right.
But yeah, thanks again for giving me the chance and the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you today. This talk is called Nature in the Metaverse, but I mean, I'll tell you the truth. I'm not 100% sure of what that means. I don't even fully know what the metaverse is or what it will be, and I don't feel that bad about that because I'm not really convinced that anyone really does. But what I do know is that a lot of people that know a lot more than me on the topic are saying that it'll be the future of how we socialize and how we work and how we play, that it'll be a $1 trillion plus industry, and that the move in that direction has already started. And I can certainly attest to that. And if that's true, then I fully believe that wildlife and conservation have to be represented. They have to play a role, and they have to benefit from that trend and not get left behind like they have a tendency to do. So what follows is, I mean, it's really an entrepreneur's journey of how and why I've come to that conclusion, and kind of one very specific idea of what I think we should do next. And now I will share my screen, and hopefully I'll do it right. Brianna, tell me if for whatever reason it doesn't come through. Okay, so let me start with a little bit of an origin story, a little bit of which I've given away. But this photograph is taken at a very, very specific moment in my life when everything changed. And I didn't know it. I didn't quite know it then, but I'm really glad I took the photograph. So this about 10 years ago, I'm in Antarctica. I'm sitting there alone on this gorgeous beach with these penguins. And this is what I did, right? This is how I spent my money. This is how I spent my time. I went on these pretty spectacular wildlife holidays. And as I was sitting here in Antarctica, and it truly, absolutely spectacular, it struck me, obviously, of course, how fantastic it was, but B, also just how totally gluttonous it was. Like I was a wildlife glutton. There's nobody benefiting from this experience except for me. And so it was really at that moment that I decided, I didn't know when, but at some point I was going to change that, and I wasn't just going to take wildlife holidays. I was going to figure out how my background could be used to benefit wildlife and to benefit nature. And this really was, I mean, that was the moment where I thought of that. If we fast forward to today, between then and now, a lot of things changed. I got divorced. I quit my job. Like I mentioned, I moved to Kenya. I got remarried. I started a company that was dedicated to wildlife conservation. But every time I think about where I am, I think back to this. I think back to this moment and how much it kind of influenced the way I thought about things. And when I got into conservation, I didn't really know much. I didn't know what problem I was gonna set out to solve with my IT skills, and I didn't want to do what many people might have a tendency to do, is just kind of look for solutions that IT can solve. But so my research really kind of just looked into, like, what was I seeing as some of the fundamental things that were driving some of the conservation issues that we've got. And I don't really know why, but I really started to look at consumer markets and the things that the extractive approaches of the things that we buy, of the services that are sold to us, of the products that are sold to us, and the impacts that starts to have on the habitat and wildlife in general. I started to look at policy and how different countries have different policy around conservation. And certainly I started to look at, quite honestly, the dearth of actual available financing. And I saw a lot of top-down solutions that were trying to address each of these, often, trying to influence governments, trying to influence donors, and trying to influence the markets from a top-down perspective. But what I really started to think about, though, was, well, wait a second. Each of these is fundamentally really driven by the will of the people, by the will of the people that live within these countries, by the consumers. It's the consumers who are demanding different products. It's the consumers who are deciding what the markets, in many ways, sell to them, and it's the consumers that have the power to change the markets and what's sold to them, and make the demands for more environmentally friendly products. It's the consumers that really dictate in most parts of the world, the public policy. And as you think about the policymakers, they're thinking about who's voting for them and what's important to the people that are voting for them. And again, it's the people that really drive that from the bottom up. And available financing, whether it's financing that's coming from bilaterals or large conservation organizations, or it's financing that's coming from individual people itself. Again, as priorities would dictate, priorities will dictate where that available financing comes from. And so I really started looking at, okay, well, this means that we really need to think about, like, the public. We need to think about the citizens of countries. We need to think about engaging them in a way that really activates and lets them express their values for what they think about wildlife and nature. And so I started to look at, what are the things that are out there that do that. And I know I'm generalizing here, but if I really look at it, it just seems like that we're divided into two categories. One is wildlife documentaries, and many people have seen, obviously, Planet Earth, and the other is wildlife donation campaigns, often run by some of the largest conservation organizations out there. And I don't mean to pick on WWF; it's just the one that I think everybody probably relates to and knows about. And I wasn't really seeing too many other things that were out there that were really intended to try and activate and to try and engage people, other than films and donation campaigns. And as I kind of looked at those, it's like, well, Planet Earth and these type of programs they're spectacular, no doubt, but they're pretty passive. You sit on your sofa and you watch them, and you're watching stuff that's happening far away. So they feel very distant. And then as you look at, at the donation campaigns, they can feel very transactional. Everything is just geared towards getting, you to hit the donate button. At that point, you just kind of become a number in the system. Maybe you'll get a certificate of adoption, and you'll probably get, a couple emails or many emails just, trying to get you to donate more. And there's nothing more that's really, that's engaging, in that process. So as I looked at that, this started to help me start formulating like, okay, what do we need to do? What are the types of, how can we activate people? And I don't like to say, a lot of people say, how can we get people to care more? I'm not of the opinion that people don't care. I'm just of the opinion that people don't have a way of activating. How is somebody in St. Louis, for example, going to connect with what's going on in Borneo? And that's where I really just started looking at the idea of creating relationships. And you think about the relationships that you have with your family and the relationships that you have with your friends, even the relationships that you have with your pets. You go to the ends of earth. You go to all means to do stuff, to save, to protect, to help your family, your friends, and your pets. Maybe most of all your pets. And that's what really started getting me thinking about, well, how could we create that same feeling, that same sentiment, with a jaguar or with a frog or with a lemur or a gorilla, to this sense that I'm willing to go to the ends of the earth, and I have a means of going to the end of the earth to make sure that those animals, prosper, that those animals do well. And that's where I really started thinking like, okay, how can we start creating relationships with these animals? And that kind of led to the next conclusion, which was, well, it's very difficult to create a connection with a species or with 10,000 orangutans, or however many sloths there are left, or the 800 mountain gorillas. You hear these stories at the species level, and you understand a little bit what's going on, but it's difficult to create that relationship. It's even difficult to do that on a human scale. And that's why we always talk about humans through their identities, through their names, through their stories. And then that then started thinking like, aha, this is what we need. If we can start connecting and creating relationships between people all over the world and wildlife and individual wildlife all over the world, that starts to lay the foundation. For becoming much more active in the conservation world, getting much more engaged. That's possible within films or within donation campaigns. So this really helped us zero in on trying to like, what can we do to create relationships between people and animals. I also started to look at like, okay, if you could create the relationships between those people and those animals, well, who are the people that would want to have those relationships? Who are the people that are open to have those relationships? And it's not a totally scientific study, but a decent study nonetheless, that we did, kind of found that, we think that above the age of 16, there's around 1.1 billion people that have a self-expressed interest in wildlife. So 41% of all internet users. And then we started to really analyze some of those people, and we found that 67% of those people, of those 1.1 billion people, are gamers. They're playing games. They're playing games on a regular basis. And again, this is above the age of 16. So again, when you think about wildlife films and you think about donation campaigns and the reach that they potentially have, and you think about games and the reach that the games have, it started to really feel like an incredible opportunity or an incredible channel to start trying to create relationships with people through games. But we still wanted to think about like, how did these identities start to come through? And that started to get a lot more familiar with what's going on in technology and IT within the conservation world. And so much of this has changed even in the 5 years that I've been doing this. But the number of organizations, products, individual scientists, etc., and what's happening in conservation tech, and many of the people in Global Biodiversity Fest may have spoken about this already. The amount of data that's being gathered about individual animals is absolutely spectacular. There's hundreds of thousands of individually tracked animals, and they may be tracked in many different ways. And the technology and the ability to do this, and the intrusiveness of it, and the security of it, it's just improving. It's just improving every single day. Wild Labs is currently running a fantastic webinar series on tracking data, and I watched one of them recently, and there was a gentleman on there, and he was putting a sensor on a wasp or a bumblebee to collect humidity data about the air. And so the amount of data that exists about actual individual animals then really started to kind of create that connection for me that there's a way of using tech to create these identities of these animals, and then use games as a way of delivering the stories to to larger audiences. And so again, an example of this, if we take Buka, who's a lowland gorilla from the Republic of Congo, the data that exists on Buka, there's photos, videos, sound recording, there's movement data about him, there's eDNA, there's an entire life story, there's a personality, like Andrea was talking about, each of these animals has personality. We know everything about its diet, its population density, its daily and monthly behavior. You have a personality, you have a true identity for an animal that you can now start thinking about. How do I tell the story of that particular animal? How do I create a relationship between Buka and people, people anywhere in the world? And this is something that, that technology, happens to really enable. And so, kind of getting to the company, Internet of Elephants, that's what we do, right? Like our intention is to create relationships between people and other species. And our approach to doing that is to use technology, the technology that exists for the people that are tracking them, and the technology of games and in current channels to try and create those connections. So we've partnered with lots of different conservation organizations and lots of conservation organizations that are willing to share their data, that are willing to look at how their data can be used to create these connections. And for a long time, we took this, and of course the data is not something that we collect, but what we do is we create the storyline on top of it. And remember, these are dynamic storylines as well, because data is not static; it's constantly moving. So we create the storylines around it. We can create the 3D models around the animals and the different avatars for them. We can bring in the content and the imagery. And then we think very, very strongly back as to when somebody does create a relationship with Buka the gorilla, how does that then benefit the conservation organizations, the scientists, the researchers, the entities that are working to protect him. In the beginning, we started to make our own games. We started to make our own products. We made a product called Wilderverse, which was an augmented reality a mobile game that brought you into the shoes of a researcher in Borneo and a researcher in Congo. We made Unseen Empire, something we did with Wild Crew, where we took their 5 million camera traps images that they did over a 10-year study, and we brought those into a game and let you see like 500 to 600, different spectacular images from Southeast Asia from these camera traps and all these animals that they were studying. We did stuff with augmented reality. We did something with Adidas where you could actually run and compete against the actual data from a snow leopard or a tiger or a pangolin and learn stories about them, along the way. What we've learned, over the course of making those games is you can make these pretty great games. That they can always be better, of course, but you can make these pretty great games. But the limits of how many people you can reach is really dependent on your own marketing capacity, your own capacity to really understand and compete within the games world. And that wasn't something that we were really feeling like we were going to be able to compete in, that we were the right ones to be able to do. But there's many, 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 many organizations out there that already have those capabilities. So we started thinking much more about, well, how can we create and how can we enable all these massive brands, these massive games, these massive different apps that are out there to start incorporating wildlife data, wildlife content, wildlife stories into the apps that already exist, and reaching the people that already have for them. And so Internet of Elephants has really kind of shifted much more now to focusing on creating that library, creating that agency, if you will, of all these animals, all their identities, all their personalities, and thinking about how can these things exist in such a way that everybody can take advantage of that. And so rather than Internet of Elephants needing to be the ones that are just making the experiences and then struggling with how we're going to get them out there, how can these animals appear in Fortnite? How can they appear in Pokemon Go? How can they be in, how can they be in the British Airways app? How can they, sit in the same way that we did with Adidas in many of different places? And of course, how can wildlife and nature be represented in the metaverse, and how can it be represented accurately in the metaverse, and how can it directly benefit wildlife and conservation, directly back. So we've kind of always been of this opinion that virtual worlds and the real world don't necessarily have to be completely disconnected. So we've really got, we're shifting. This is the direction that we're taking right now, which is very specifically to say, how can we create a value proposition that these stories, and we already know that animal content sells. How can we create a scenario where where these things become attractive to these brands? And so, if I give you a couple of examples, and let's take Buka, the lowland gorilla, and all the data that exists about Buka. How can Buka become an individual animal within Minecraft that players can include in their own environments, and the different characteristics of Buka, they come through in its in his movement and its behavior and all the storylines again. And how can you do that across thousands and thousands of animals in a product like Minecraft that reaches 100 million people? How could British Airways potentially, as you're using the in-flight tracker while you're flying, and as you're flying over the People's Republic of Congo, how can that potentially activate an opportunity for you to zoom in and learn about the animals that you're flying over, and again at the individual level. And then, as I mentioned, if you're participating in the metaverse, and again, predictions are that everybody soon will, and you're going to have a virtual work meeting, why not have a virtual work meeting actually in Ndoki National Park, with the possibility that that a representation of Buka and his family might start walking by. And the whole intention of this is to create this virtuous circle, essentially, where scientists and conservation organizations that are collecting the data, are able to participate. We go ahead and we add in the stories, we add in the models, we add in the imagery, and we start to create this entire library of these different animal personalities that are there. And then those personalities, are now starting to come through in different experiences that are out there in the metaverse, which then gets, hopefully is starting to reach hundreds of millions of people, billions of people, in a way that no single product, that no single film, could ever do. And all the while, all of that eventually kind of circles back and benefits the very same scientists and conservation organizations that provided that data in the first place, allowing them to then continue to do that type of work, more and more and more. And so, that's kind of the shift that we make. That's the journey that we make. Like we talk about the metaverse, it can, I know a lot of people are talking about NFTs and things like that now. And often I look at that and I really ask the why, like, is it you trying to get rich quickly? Are you jumping on a trend, that happens to be going on now? Or is there a fundamental basis for why we're trying to do that? And so when I talk about the metaverse and how nature and wildlife can and should be represented, I think that's all founded on this basis of trying to create relationships, between people and other species, and the opportunity that both conservation tech as well as metaverse tech, game tech, virtual world tech now provides us, to create this actually incredible opportunity, to create those relationships. And I really think that if we're able to do that, it will fundamentally shift. It will fundamentally shift the landscape of conservation, for the next 50 years. And so I think with that, I am finished, and happy to take questions or give you back some time.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I had never really thought about the metaverse as being a place to learn about the real wildlife that's out there. I'm adding the banner here, Internet of Elephants, for our viewers to check out themselves. We do have a question here from the chat that I'm going to get started with. Actually, it's a comment. Very cool how you're using your experience to create personas for this species, so we can incorporate them in conservation efforts with corporate partnerships. And I think that's touching on something that I think is really interesting about your work. You're not preaching to the choir. It's really about getting everybody who's online to have the opportunity to see the species behind you on a Zoom call or on a tech call, or as you're flying over on a flight to learn about a species that you're flying over. So my question is really about, who's your target? It's really the internet, but are there certain groups that are more that are easier to target, or are there certain, is it corporate, is it gamers, is it really Gen Z, millennials, or is there a certain focus that you're looking to target?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's always the right question to ask under these, on any of these things. It used to be, it was very specific on a product by product basis. You were targeting someone different. So, like with the camera trap project, we were targeting a little bit more of an audience that was already interested in data visualizations, and might be more of a Nat Geo audience. Whereas something like Wilderverse, like, how about people that go to zoos? And this is the way we often think: is who are those people who have an interest in wildlife, care, which again I think most people do, but are not activated, are not thinking about it from a conservation, a conservation point of view. And I often think about that in terms of people, people that go to zoos. They have, they're in a way expressing their interest in wildlife, but in no way are they kind of taking back any opportunity to activate with conservation with it. But I do look at that again, back to that one slide that I gave, which was like, hey, there's these 1.1 billion people, again, over the age of 16, that have self-expressed, in various different ways that wildlife is of interest to them, and 70% of them are playing games. And so it's, I guess we're targeting that 770 million people, which is not a narrow area, but it's far greater than the choir, like you indicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm excited to see this come to life even more. I do have another question, and it's really looking at looking at stories and animal stories. So if you could humor me, and can you share another animal story and what you've learned? Because I think it's so cool how, technology and conservation is really focused on data collection, and what you're doing is totally different. It's taking that data and adding an actual personality to it. So can you humor me and share another personality of an animal?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, we work with an organization here called Space for Giants, and there was an elephant that we worked on their data, and his name was Moituria, and he's a crop raider. And not only is he a crop raider, which the data shows, he teaches other elephants how to crop raid. He teaches other elephants how to break elephant fences. And so when you look at his data and what he does, and exactly how he times it, he times it exactly for a certain point in time when he knows that people aren't going to be around, and he leaves the crops at a certain time, in the morning, right before, people start to come in. Like, well, that's, it's an amazing, like, if you want to talk about wildlife human conflict, it's a tough topic. But if you can tell, and I'm not saying to make light of it, but if you can tell stories about this, and you can show the data, it can really, bring that to life for somebody. And of course, if you talk about crop raiding elephants and human wildlife conflict, it's a harder connection to make than if you talk about Moituria, the crop raiding elephant that does it for this reason and teaches all the young males to do the same. And there's just so, I can go on, and I know you're going to run out of time, but there's so many stories like this that that we think the data really brings to life. And if you can create these identities, I mean, you can create relationships that never existed before.
That's amazing. Well, check them out, everyone. internetofelephants.com, banners up there. And thank you, Gautam. We are out of time, and we'll be sure to keep following you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.